My name is Gustavo Deco, and I am in Barcelona, and I am working basically in computational neuroscience, theoretical neuroscience. And during the last, I think, 10 years, we switched from microcircuits to whole brain dynamics and whole brain models. And this is exactly what I am trying to explain you. I mean, it's a very short criminal overview of the basic ideas of underlying whole brain modeling. So let's see. Okay, great. So as I said, I mean, so I will try to give you some background on the more essential elements underlying whole brain modeling. Historically, I mean, and given that this is a pedagogical lecture, I mean, I will refer to the history. Whole brain models was first developed in the context of resting state activity, and you have already heard a lot probably about that. I would just try to motivate this from my personal perspective and my personal point of view, why that was interesting. I have to also to say that since many years, whole brain model were now extended to the context of task conditions, so that actually it's not only restricted to resting state. But at the very beginning, because the jump from microcircuit to the whole brain level was really challenging, we tried to identify a condition where we could achieve some explanation of the brain dynamics, and the brain dynamic is simple enough so that we have a chance really to explain something. And that was exactly the time of the resting state, as you know, which is pretty counterintuitive, because as from an historical point of view, I mean, neuroscience was always applying what is cartoonized here, this inverse engineering type of a strategy. I mean, when you have a black box and you want to identify this black box, I mean, the best that you can do is really to generate many inputs, which in our case corresponds to many tasks, many type of sensorial excitation, and to produce something. In our case, it's also very rich, as you know. I mean, there are all the ways that we have to describe the brain behavior or macroscopic activity, as evidenced by fMRI, EEG, or even microscopic activity. So it's very rich. But that was the strategy. I mean, we're always task-oriented, and the only way, and in fact, it's extremely and was extremely successful. We learn a lot by applying this philosophy. Of course, I mean, here there is a little assumption that we were forgetting during many decades, and it's that this philosophy, in the context of our black box, that it's complex enough, it's the brain. Work is, of course, the underlying resting state. So when nothing happened, when the brain is isolated, it's not excited, it's not engaged with any kind of task, it's trivial. Trivial means that it's a low energy state, or has no particular spatio-temporal structure. So if you want, it's just activity that looks like noise and low amplitude noise. If that works, and if that is true, then we can really distort that and learn something. And as you can imagine, that is not the case. I mean, I always explain this in the context of a black box, which is much more simple. It's not the system brain. And let's assume that for the moment, the black box is the system water, much simple. And then we can apply this philosophy that was explained to you at the very beginning. So we have the water in the resting state, was absolutely low energy, in fact was static, not even noisy. And then we excited the water by this falling drop, and then we generated some output, that is this expanding traveling waves. And by establishing a relationship between these inputs and the output, between the strain of the falling drop and the traveling wave, we learn a lot about the physics of the water. And that works perfect because, as I said, the underlying assumption here is true. I mean, the water, if it's not perturbed, it's absolutely in a trivial low energy space. But imagine for a moment that is not the case, and what I'm trying to suggest is that this is the case of the brain, that at rest, so when we are doing nothing in particular, when we are not excited, we are not engaged with any kind of task, the resting state is very well structured, spatio-temporally. So it's not quite water as we have seen before, but it's like this wavy sea type of water. Of course, we can still apply the philosophy as we described that before. We have to apply an input and an output, but now we cannot forget really the underlying activity. And that is a problem per se, because that means we were trying to forget that, but if that has an influence in the way how we process the input, how we perform in the different tasks, then we need to consider that. And that's, of course, a disadvantage, and it's a bad news. But the good news, and that was the initial point for starting doing some modeling, is that if I forget this philosophy, if instead of concentrated on task condition, on cognition, that is for the starting point very complex, we just concentrate on the isolated spontaneous state condition, the so-called resting state condition. This is rich enough so that we can still describe that and learn something about the brain. And that was the motivation why it makes sense really to do model at that level. Of course, I mean, what I am trying to show now, I mean, in a very short way, my favorite evidences of, and nowadays we have really thousands of evidence, why the brain, the resting state condition of the brain is really like this second movie where we have the waves, the traveling waves like in the sea. So that is this work from Fox was a seminal work where they study with fMRI resting state conditions, practically for the first time, I mean, during a long duration, and many minutes. And what you see here in a very astonishing way, even without mathematics, just by eye, I mean, that's if you concentrate on one particular seat here, basically in the anterior part of the cortex and the prefrontal cortex, on the other side of the cortex, so one in yellow and the other in red, and this is the ball signal. Basically, you see here just by eye, and of course you can do all the statistics and formalize this in a quantitative way, but here you see that they go hand by hand, so they are strongly correlated. In fact, what happens is that if you take this really the PCC as a seat, and then you see with whom all the other boxes that are strongly correlated with the PCC, then you see these reactions. And this is what we call nowadays a resting state network. In fact, this is a very well-known resting state network, which has the name of the four-mode network. And this is very astonishing, and it's absolutely unexpected, because, as I say, if the brain is not engaged with any kind of task, what you would expect is, of course, it's alive, so there are consumption of energy, but a low consumption of energy, a low level of activity, but that activity should be, by definition, uncorrelated. There shouldn't be any kind of spatial temporal type of correlation. And here we see, at least at the temporal level, between two points which are really far away from each other, they shouldn't be communicating under this condition, and they are, at least as evidenced by the correlation, communicating. Of course, it's not the whole brain communicating. The brain is segregated in different networks. If you take another point, for example, here in the lateral parietal sulcus, and then you see who is connected, who is correlated with this guy, evidently this network that we have seen before is not correlated with that. Even more in this paper was suggested that was anti-correlated, but there were some problems with that. It's not important to stress that. What I want to say is that this network, the blue network, has another set of regions which are strongly correlated with that particular seat and are not correlated, it's not part of the first network. That means that there are many different resting state networks, and But the main, I think, and the most astonishing result is that the number of those resting state networks is relatively small and is very limited. And even more, they have a name. And why they have a name? Have a name because people have seen that before in the context of a task. For example, when they were performing different type of attentional control tasks, this network appear, or when they were doing some visual tasks, of course, I mean, the visual cortex appear, and so on. So that means that these complex dynamics that emerge from billions of neurons and billions of connections, in reality live in a very, very small dimensional manifold, which are the networks. And those networks really, depending on the methodology that you use, can be in the human between 7 and 17 or even more, but there are extremely small number of networks, and they are stable across the population, across humans, and I want just to remember you that the resting state condition, at least how it was operationalized from the very beginning, is not so well controlled because we are asking really humans just to do nothing. I mean, as you know, that it's very difficult. But in spite of that, still we see always the same manifold across all the different steps. So that was also very inspiring and a motivation for modeling, because that means that if those networks really have something to do with the task, even under this very particular condition, which is the resting state condition, so we are not doing explicitly the task, we can learn something through the dynamics about the task. And that was the beginning of the model. In fact, the first suggestion for a good model actually came from a group that were not doing modeling. It's a group of Marcus Reichel that discovered the deformed network, and together with Mauricio Corbetta, they implemented for the first time in this Nature paper resting state conditions, much more controlled because they use it the monkey, Macaca mulata, and of course you cannot convince the monkey to be impressed, and therefore they use anesthesia, light anesthesia, so it was much more controlled condition. And in the first two pictures, left in the middle, you see exactly the same take-home measure that we have been discussing until now. So that's, and the resting state condition in particular, you see this strong correlation between distant region. In this case, it's the visual motor resting state network of the monkey. Of course, there are other networks, but just to simplify the cartoon, they just plotted this. So remember, here the monkey is practically anesthetized. I mean, and still you see this strong correlation. When the monkey is awake and is performing, in fact, a visual motor task, you see basically exactly the same network. And that is what I was telling you before. This is the reason why this network receives the name visual motor, because when the monkey is really executing the visual motor task, you see it basically the same network. And the good news is that I don't need to execute explicitly the visual motor task, just under resting state condition, just under anesthesia in this case. Basically, I can even learn something about the dynamics underlying a particular cognitive task. But the most important part of the figure, and it's the beginning of the modeling, basically, or the idea of modeling, is this anatomical connectivity pattern. So when this is function, so this pulse signal, the fMRI in the monkey, and this is a structure. So these are the results of track tracing studies performed on that monkey. And what you see is that now concentrated on the same network, the visual motor, that's basically those regions are strong connected. So they are wide in the area, there are a physical connection between that. And that explains already or suggests an explanation for the emergence of this correlation. Of course, under resting state condition, we will have noise because we have low activity and we are not engaging the brain in anything in concrete, but because we are now coupling the different source of noise here in the frontal part or here in the parietal visual part, we are wiring that, we are coupling that explicitly, physically, then we start to introduce a correlation. And that would be the explanation. And the first very intuitive, non-mathematical model of a resting state type of activity. The good news is that, of course, this is a way of basically reflecting the underlying anatomy, the underlying physical connections through functionalities. And given that we have different methodologies, and perhaps it's even easy to identify, that's an advantage. From the modeling point of view, of course, it's extremely boring and disappointing because it's extremely trivial. But the question is this really a good explanation? I mean, it's really the underlying anatomy shaping, not determining, but at least shaping the functionality. And this is what we can answer in the context now of model. And we have all the elements. We have the very concrete question. And the idea is now to relate the underlying anatomy, which in the case of animals would be track tracing studies of much better quality. In the case of humans, of course, we are not so lucky, and therefore we are using tractography, the MRI tractography. And the key question of the model is now to transform this underlying anatomy, this underlying coupling, physical connection between the different brain areas for a given parcellation. And then you put in each node your favorite local dynamics, or what you think is the credible local dynamics. Then you couple this local dynamics to the anatomy. You generate some global macroscopic functionality that you can describe with the correlation, as we have seen during the first slides. So meaning that here in this matrix, which is area by area, we have the description of the underlying anatomy, and this is the structural connectome. Here in this matrix, which is called the functional connectome, we have the correlations, the functional correlation, as evidenced with fMRI, EMG, or whatever is your favorite instrument for expressing that. And the key idea is that if this, so local dynamics plus the anatomical connection is really a good model. So meaning if the simulated functional connectivity is really a good model of the real functional connectivity that we measure experimentally. Then now that we will see that the first generation of models are not so trivial. So it's not that for every possibilities, and possibilities here is very concrete. I mean, we assume, and it's a strong simplification, but that was a starting point, as I say, it's an historical talk. We assume that all the couplings are described by the same type of conductivity. So of course, I mean, different regions are connected with different fiber density, but we assume that each fiber has exactly the same conductivity. So what that means is that we have only one parameter for expressing really the effectivity of the coupling. Nowadays, we can do much better. We can use effective connectivity, meaning that we can use really, we can associate for each fiber a different parameter. But at the beginning, it makes a lot of sense, really, to simplify the problem, assume that there is only one parameter that we call the coupling parameter. And the key question is now, if it is really as was described by this paper of Marcus Reichel and Corbetta that I mentioned before, the Vincent et al. Paper, the key question is that, is this working for all possible type of parameters? So if I move, and that is reflected in this cartoon, if this is the coupling parameter, my only free parameter of the model, called the global coupling. So is this true that for the broad region or for all possible possibilities of this global coupling parameter, I have resting state? And the answer is no, and it's cartoonized here. It's not, because we will see this defined different attractor states, and those different attractor states that could be very simple, so like a very simple attractor of low activity over the whole regions of the brain, that depending on the region where you are, start to reflect more or less correlation, so will fit more or less the resting state, or even you can cross some critical regions, which are called bifurcations, regions where you start to generate many other attractors. And of course, here the question is which underlying structure of attractor is the one revealing the resonance state. It is clear that the both extremes cannot work, because if you are zero, you are multiplying basically the anatomy by zero, so you are disconnected. So by definition, you will have like noise. So it's not a good resting state. And if you have this very large value, also intuitively, you will couple this a lot, and basically what you would generate is a kind of epileptic brain, which of course is not consistent with resting state activity. So therefore, in the first generation of model, we took really our favorite way of expressing the local neuronal dynamics using integrate and fire neurons, 80% excitatory, 20% inhibitory, with realistic description of the underlying synapses like alpha, NMD, or inhibitory GABA. And then they were identical, they were homogeneous for all the regions in our parcellation, and we started to connect them through the underlying description of the anatomy as given by the DTI tractography. Of course, you can simplify, well, this is what I told you before, sorry, rapidly, you can express this mathematically, each neuron, each pair connections to the different synapses, AMPA, NMDA, and GABA, and express really in a relatively large system of differential equations how the system works. If you couple that through the anatomy, and now we study, and this is not a cartoon, this is the result of the result of the simulation. This is the global coupling parameter. This is the correlation between the simulated and the empirical functional connectivity, so between what you generate functionally, what emerged from this system of anatomy plus local spike in activity. And what you see very clearly, that's because it's a correlation, the larger the better, means that there is a particular point, which is associated with the bifurcation point, as we will see now, where we have the best fitting. And this is very important because it's not somewhere, it's also not so very broad, somewhere in the middle, but in a very particular point. It's at the brink of a bifurcation. In fact, what we see here is the bifurcation structure of that system that we can analyze from a dynamical point of view. And what is reflected here, again, the same axis, coupling strength. But now what we are reflecting here is the attractors, and basically the mean firing activity of the attractor that you saw in the cartoon at the beginning. Of course, it is low enough from 0 to something. We have only one global attractor of low activity, but of course, they could reflect different level of correlations. And these attractors at some point lose stability. This is reflected here. So you can imagine here like this landscape, and where you see that this is the stable attractor, and at some point there is a second bifurcation where you lose stability. And here, practically the noise activity is reflecting, which is around the other attractors that appear at some other points, is reflecting at best the functional connectivity. And that makes a lot of sense, because what that means is that, of course, I don't need to be in the, let's say, cognitive attractors, because I'm not doing a task. So that would be a wasting of energy. But I need to be really near enough, and near enough means at that point where I am also not so obsessed with the global attractor, and therefore the noise is able to reflect at that particular point this structure that we call resting state functional connectivity. If I would be here, of course, I am not consuming energy, but I am not good in reflecting by the noise the structure, the cognitive structure, because I am far away. And in fact, this is what is shown here. If I need to excite a concrete attractor, let's say a visual attractor, for example, and I stimulate a beam from here, I need really a very strong input, and even the reaction time to jump from here to here is extremely long, even with the strong input. On the other hand, if I am here, I am very optimal, because I can really, with just a gentle input, very rapidly with a short reaction time go to the right attractor. And this is the reason why probably the system decided to work here, not here, because energetically they are equivalent, but this particular position reflecting the resonance activity is very optimal for being ready to jump to cognitive position. The good news is that because we are here, then the noise is indeed reflecting the structure, the cognitive structure of given by the attractors linked with tasks, but without being there, being really still at the resting state. And that was the main take, the first main take message of a model. It was extremely good news and was related with this really very well detailed models of the local dynamics of spiking neurons that of course you can simplify in terms of mean field, in terms of neural mass models of different style, and that's what the different labs and even our own lab were working during many years. The bad news is that at some point, some people started to do really very simple things. So I say, well, let's forget for a moment the spiking neurons, mean field, and all the refined biophysical detail, just put noise and put noise plus anatomy, which was basically the initial idea. But we were distracted by this idea of biophysical release. And this is already reflecting the functional connectivity that are the paper of Arnaud Messé, which is astonishing because then meaning that the dynamic seems to be much more simple. Or in the other extreme, basically the work of Joanna Cabral was the PhD of Joanna in my lab. I mean, if you go to the other extreme and say, well, no, instead of noise, I put extreme oscillation. I mean, she used it basically Kuramoto oscillation. So we have perfect oscillation that also works. So we have two extremes, noise, artificial noise, realistic biophysical noise, or extreme oscillations, and everything works. In fact, I mean, this is from the work of Joanna, using EMG resting state. And what they are reflecting is some regions, which of course, in this case, you need another parameter. It's not only the coupling strength, you need also to introduce delay, but there are some regions where you can explain really very well the data. And that region is also characterized not by a very complete bifurcation, because here we cannot perform the analysis, but a very particular working point, which is a point where you don't have full synchronization, as you see here is a measure of the synchronization. You don't have full synchronization. You are not unsynchronized. This is measured by the Kuramoto of the parameter. But this is an intermediate region where you have intermediate synchronization. So you have cluster synchronization, but you have a rich switching activity between those clusters. So the variability of the synchronization is the mean, and the variability is strong. This is what we call metastability, and it's fantastic because that means that under this particular resonance condition, we have a rich dynamical repertoire. What is not fantastic is what I said at the beginning, is that with all these different models, with all these complex names relating to this noise, neural mass models or oscillatory models, basically the take-home message is that if you compare with functional connectivity, then basically you have exactly the same. I would like to finish by saying, well, what that means is not that the models are all equal. They cannot be all equal. They are extremely different. One is noise and the other is oscillation. But we cannot disentangle them because perhaps our belief that the functional connectivity is omnipotent, I mean, and was describing everything is of course wrong. I mean, it's just a very simple way of describing the functional activity is average across time. So therefore we call the grand average static spatial connectivity. And that is the reason why we cannot disentangle the model. If you take other measures which are more detailed, the most trivial one was proposed in 2013 by the lab of Vince Kalum. And basically we call them a quantitative version of that in a paper together with Victor Jirsa. In 2015, we call that the functional connectivity dynamics. The idea is very simple. You use basically just a sliding window. So instead of using the whole window, you use a small window, and you see that in that small window, you calculate the functional connectivity or the principal component of the functional connectivity or the evolution of really of some random pairs here. What you see is that it's changing in time. So meaning that we add the temporal dimension to that. And of course, by adding the temporal dimension, we can learn a lot. And basically now we have all the elements because we have better observables. We can generalize the model in such a way that we can ask explicitly by fitting, by the working point of the model, if the model is working in the noisy behavior or in the oscillatory behavior. And the essential trick is basically to use the general philosophy, coupling dynamics with anatomy. But now the local dynamics is very general. It's called Stewart-Landau oscillator or Hopf oscillators, because describes the normal form of a Hopf bifurcation. Basically, it's able to describe by an internal parameter just a fixed point. That's because you have added noise. It's basically the noisy region. Or the other extreme, which is extremely oscillatory. And therefore, this is called a Stewart-Landau oscillator, because the difference with the Kuramoto oscillator is that you can manipulate the amplitude, so that at some point the amplitude even disappears, so the oscillator disappears. And in fact, in that bifurcation point, which is a Hopf bifurcation point, you have a mixture between noise and oscillation. Because the time is running out, I just try to simplify and tell you that basically combining this Hopf model and fitting the Hopf model by using all these measures, the standard one, the static one, the temporal one, more than one version. I just mentioned the functional connectivity dynamic. We can even use also what we mentioned on the metastability as another possible measure, describing the spatiotemporal dynamics. And by doing this, in fact, the model, which is now also described by two elements, the global coupling as always, and this local bifurcation parameter, deciding if you are working in the noisy region, in the noisy scenario, in the intermediate scenario, or in the oscillatory scenario. Now we can disentangle with all these three measures, functional connectivity dynamics, metastability, and many others. Just an example, that the best working region is really somewhere at the edge of the bifurcation. So at that particular region, and these are the cuts, we see in all these different level of fitting, this maximal correlation, this maximal or minimal distance between the functional connectivity dynamics and statistics, or maximal fitting of the metastability. This can be seen very clear exactly at the Hopf bifurcation, where the Stewart-Landau have the amplitude zero. So it's a perfect mixture of noise and oscillation. We have a perfect fitting of all these three things, these different measures, and therefore we can really disentangle the scenario. So take home message, I mean, how all the models evolved, not only by adding more information, more description, which is not always has a biophysical character. I mean, of course, the Hopf bifurcation has a biophysical interpretation, and it's a particular point in the balance of excitation inhibition. But it's much easier sometimes to approach the problem with the conceptual idea than with the biophysical detail idea. And one element, and the second element, that's also the richness of the observables that nowadays we are using. It was at the beginning, as you have heard already in the last talk of Kata, I mean, that even much more refined functional observable that we can use that for the model. I think I've stopped here because I planned something more, but I think it's enough and the time is gone. So I hope that I was able to transmit you a little bit about the underlying mechanisms of whole brain dynamics and what we learned.